Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode number 23 in the book of 1 Peter. Today's title is Arming Up Like Jesus Did. I just love this. We have a weaponized Jesus. We have an armed up Jesus. We have a ready to fight Jesus, and not just ready to fight, an actual fighting Jesus. So we're going to ask today, how was he armed up? We have to know, because then after we understand it, then there's this big ask. And here's the ask. I'm supposed to be armed up in the same way as Jesus. And here's the spoiler. It's the way that he thinks. So arming up like Jesus will be thinking like Jesus. This is from 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. Read with me. Find your Bible. A lot of this is from verse 1. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourself with the same way of thinking as Jesus. Arm yourself with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past, suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking, parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery. That's a great term. And they malign you. But they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh, the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. All right, we have to talk about Jesus' suffering. And I think it's helpful, in my humble opinion, to think about Christ's suffering in two main ways. Now, the first one is him suffering in the flesh and on the cross at Golgotha, in front of the Praetorian God, when he was flogged and mocked and beaten and crucified. So that's the one that most people think about when they say, oh, Christ suffered. So how did he respond to that? Well, we have to go to the nuclear power plant of 1 Peter, which is in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. For this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So on the cross, what's Jesus doing? He's engaging this nuclear power plant, expressing verbal restraint. I guess that would be not expressing verbal restraint, not threatening, not attacking, and inside his head, entrusting and being mindful of God. This is mentally, we're supposed to be doing the same way of thinking. So Jesus, in a process inside his head, then it's spilled outside his head. So he presented himself to the Lord, mindful of the Father, entrusting himself to the Father. And then it resulted in verbal restraint, no threatening, no attacking, and no returning revile for revile. So that's the first one. That's Jesus suffering on the cross. There's a second suffering that Jesus did, and that was during the rest of his life. That was the temptations of his life. So when he and we are tempted, it's difficult. It's called suffering. So as long as temptations are resisted, it's difficult. It's suffering. As soon as you yield to temptation, the suffering goes away in a sense. So Hebrews 4:15, we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted, yet is without sin. And this is later. Draw near to the throne of grace to receive mercy and find help in our time of need. And when's our time of need? Well, we're going to have the same temptations, the same suffering. So Jesus' life is characterized by suffering. And specifically what it means here during the other 33 years of his life is resistance to temptation. So Jesus' life is characterized by suffering and temptation. So Hebrews 2:18 explains that. Temptation resisted, fought against, and thought against is suffering. For because he himself has suffered when tempted. So Jesus suffered before. Here's my point on this. The second point here is that Jesus suffered before he got to Golgotha. He suffered before the cross. He suffered during the other years. How? When resisting temptations, he experienced pain and endured this difficult experience. So back to 1 Peter 4 now, our passage for today. Arm yourself with the same way of thinking as Jesus. So this is Jesus. It's war and it's weaponizing, which we're supposed to equip ourselves with a weapon. What's the weapon? The weapon is the same way of thinking of Jesus. So we have to make ourselves ready in thought, prepare our head first, get our spiritual heads in the game. When we resist sin, we will be suffering in the flesh. The passions that we're talking about here are the passions of the tongue, passions of pride, of the wallet, of vanity, passions of the zipper. Our thinking is going to result in actions that we can see in all those areas. So the response to people around, of course, because you see a response from another world, they give an external response, which is to malign you. They're going to attack you. They're going to revile you. In other words, they're not going to attack the argument. They're going to attack you personally. So don't be surprised. They're going to give an account, and that's why the gospel came, it says here. So they're going to need a rescue of the gospel. Hopefully they'll live in the spirit of someday just like you are. All right, so here's the conclusions. When you arm yourself like him, you will think like him. When you think like him, you will act like him. When you act like him, you're going to be responded to like him, and that's going to involve some reviling. So suffer like him. This is the call. Maybe in some heroic, external, life-threatening way like Jesus did on the cross, but for sure you're going to be suffering with him in temptation and resisting temptation. You are going to need to be armed, ready, equipped, the same way of thinking as Jesus is supposed to be inside your head. That is, in trusting, be mindful of God, and enduring. Be armed with the same way of thinking as Jesus. Thanks for listening.